Story 1. The Whispering Shadows. Emily had always been an urbanite, thriving in the buzz of city life, but her newfound pursuit of solitude led her to a cabin deep in the woods. She believed that isolation would inspire her writing, but she hadn't accounted for the isolation being this consuming. The cabin itself was a relic, creaking wooden floors, a fireplace that exhaled ash instead of warmth, and an old grandfather clock that ticked unevenly, as if mocking her sense of time. The first night was tranquil. The silence was almost meditative, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. On the second night, the tranquility shattered. As Emily sat at her desk, crafting her protagonist's escape from a fictional murderer, a whisper brushed against her ear. She froze, her fingers hovering above her laptop. "Help me," the voice said. It was faint but unmistakable, like a breath that didn't belong. Emily spun around, her heart racing, but the room was empty. She dismissed it as a trick of her tired mind and returned to her writing. Yet as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. They spoke in fragmented phrases, their tones pleading, sometimes angry. By midnight, she could barely think over the cacophony of disembodied voices. On the third night, the whispers turned into something physical. Shadows began to stretch unnaturally across the walls. They moved even when there was no light to cast them. Emily tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the wind, or maybe her stress manifesting as hallucinations. But when one shadow reached out, grazing her arm with a freezing touch, she knew this was no delusion. The mark it left burned like frostbite. Desperate, Emily packed her belongings, leaving behind her half-finished manuscript. She fled the cabin in the dead of night, not daring to look back. Weeks later, the next tenant discovered her laptop, the screen still displaying the final, haunting sentence Emily had written, and the shadows whispered my name. Years later, hikers reported seeing the cabin's windows flicker with light on moonless nights, though no one dared enter. Some claimed they heard whispers in the woods, and others returned with frost-bitten marks on their arms, all of them recounting the same chilling phrase they couldn't shake. "Help me." Story 2. The Forgotten Asylum. Lucas had always been drawn to the macabre. Abandoned buildings, ghost stories, urban legends. They were his playground. So when he heard about St. Miriam's Asylum, a place infamous for its grim history, he knew he had to explore it. The asylum had been abandoned for decades after a fire consumed its west wing, killing dozens of patients and staff. Locals whispered that the spirits of the lost still roamed its halls. Lucas arrived at the asylum just after sunset, armed with his trusty flashlight and camera. The building loomed against the dark sky, its broken windows like empty eyes. He pushed open the rusted front doors, their groan echoing through the cavernous lobby. The air inside was thick, damp, and suffocating. As he wandered through the asylum, Lucas documented everything. Graffiti-covered walls, overturned gurneys, and old medical charts scattered like confetti. The further he ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. In the basement, he stumbled upon a room that seemed untouched by time. Rusted medical instruments sat on a blood-stained table. In the center of the room was a shrine. Candles melted to their stubs encircled a photograph of a young girl. Curious, Lucas picked up the photo. The instant his fingers touched it, a piercing scream filled the room. He dropped the picture, his heart hammering in his chest. The scream morphed into distorted laughter that echoed around him, seemingly coming from the walls themselves. The candles, long extinguished, suddenly burst into flame, casting flickering shadows that seemed to reach for him. Lucas fled, but the asylum felt like a labyrinth. Corridors stretched impossibly long, doors led to dead ends, and the air grew colder with each step. Just as he thought he was trapped forever, he saw her, the girl from the photograph. She stood at the end of the hall, her expression unreadable, her eyes locked onto his. She whispered his name, and darkness swallowed him whole. When Lucas awoke, he was lying on the grass outside the asylum, his camera missing. A week later, hikers found the camera near the building's entrance. Among the photos were images Lucas didn't remember taking, shots of him wandering the halls with the girl standing silently behind him in every frame. Months after the incident, urban explorers began reporting a new addition to the asylum's ghostly legends. Some swore they heard frantic footsteps echoing in the basement or saw flickers of a flashlight in the distance. A few even claimed to have glimpsed Lucas himself, his face pale and his voice faint, as if calling for help from the shadows. Story 3. The Silent Neighbor. Sarah was thrilled when she moved into her new apartment. It was affordable, spacious, and located in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for her. Her only neighbor was an elderly woman named Mrs. Callahan, who lived across the hall. Mrs. Callahan was reclusive, but Sarah often heard her shuffling around her apartment or watching TV late at night. One evening, Sarah decided to introduce herself. She baked cookies and knocked on Mrs. Callahan's door, but there was no response. Assuming the woman was asleep, Sarah left the cookies on the doorstep and returned to her apartment. The next morning, the cookies were gone, and a thank you note written in shaky handwriting was slipped under her door. Sarah smiled, thinking she had made a small connection. This became a routine. Sarah would leave small treats, and Mrs. Callahan would respond with notes. But something changed one night. Sarah heard loud, frantic banging coming from Mrs. Callahan's apartment. Concerned, she rushed to knock on the door, but the noise stopped abruptly. Silence followed, thick and unnerving. The next day, Sarah called the landlord, worried about Mrs. Callahan. The landlord hesitated before revealing something chilling. Mrs. Callahan had died over a year ago. Her apartment had been vacant ever since. Confused and frightened, Sarah insisted the landlord open the apartment. Inside, the air was stale, the furniture coated in dust. There was no sign of life. That evening, Sarah returned home, her thoughts racing. When she opened her door, she froze. Another note awaited her, placed neatly on the counter. "Thank you for the cookies." Weeks later, Sarah began hearing faint whispers in her apartment at night. They called her name, softly at first, then louder and more insistent. She moved out soon after, but the whispers followed her to her new home. On her last night in the apartment, she found one final note slipped under her door, written in the same shaky handwriting. "Don't leave me alone again." Story 4. The Midnight Train. Jake's job often required late-night commutes, leaving him alone at a near-deserted train station. One evening, as he waited for his usual train, he noticed another train pulling into the far platform. Its carriages gleamed, immaculate and inviting. The station's schedule didn't list this train, but curiosity compelled Jake to approach. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing an empty interior. Jake hesitated before stepping inside, his footsteps echoing in the eerily silent carriage. As soon as he boarded, the doors closed behind him, and the train began to move. Looking out the window, Jake realized something was wrong. The familiar cityscape dissolved into a landscape of dark, twisting shapes. The buildings bent unnaturally, their edges sharp and menacing. The sky turned a sickly green, and the stars seemed to blink out one by one. Jake tried to move to another carriage, but each one was stranger than the last. One was filled with mannequins posed in lifelike scenes, their faces eerily realistic. Another held mirrors that didn't reflect his image, but instead showed a shadowy figure standing behind him. When the train finally stopped, Jake stepped out onto a platform that seemed to exist outside of reality. Shadows flitted in the distance, whispering his name. He turned to reboard the train, but it vanished before his eyes, leaving him stranded in the unknown. Rumors of the phantom train spread among late-night commuters. Some claimed to see its gleaming carriages, while others spoke of a shadowy figure peering through the windows. Those who boarded were never seen again, except in passing reflections or the faint sound of their voices echoing through empty train stations. Story 5. The Watcher in the Woods. Every summer, Anna, Mark, Sophie, and Liam camped in the same forest. It was their tradition, a weekend of hiking, campfires, and stories under the stars. But this year felt different. From the moment they arrived, an unshakable feeling of being watched hung over them. The first night, they heard branches snapping in the distance. Mark brushed it off as wildlife, but Sophie was uneasy. On the second night, strange symbols appeared carved into the trees surrounding their campsite. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic. Anna joked about local teenagers pulling pranks, but her laughter was hollow. On the third night, Anna woke up to a figure standing just outside her tent. Its silhouette was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. She screamed, waking the others, but by the time they emerged, the figure was gone. They decided to leave, but the forest seemed to conspire against them. Trails they knew well led to dead ends, and their compass spun wildly. As dusk fell, the figure returned, standing just beyond the firelight. Its voice was low and guttural when it finally spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The next morning, rescuers found their campsite abandoned. The only trace of the group was Anna's camera, containing a single photo, the four friends standing together. But in the background, faintly visible among the trees, stood the same tall, gaunt figure with its shadowy face. The photo's timestamp indicated it was taken hours after they had supposedly vanished. Despite extensive searches, Anna, Mark, Sophie, and Liam were never found. Hikers who ventured into the forest afterward reported an unsettling feeling of being watched, and some returned with similar symbols carved into nearby trees. To this day, locals warn against camping in those woods, claiming that if you listen closely at night, you can hear a low, guttural voice echoing in the darkness. "You shouldn't have come,"